Viper 1, status report. You are drifting off the kill box. The voice in the earpiece was feminine, calm, and terrifyingly devoid of static, cutting through the deafening roar of the 30mm chain gun fire shredding the concrete wall above Jackson's head. Master Chief Jackson spat out grit, pressing his back harder against the crumbling cover. Shadow Actual, we are pinned. Intel was wrong. There is a mechanized battalion sitting on the extraction point. We need air support now. Negative on air support, Viper 1. The airspace is contested by S-400 batteries. If I send birds in, they die. You have 30 seconds to breach the northern heavy door before the patrol loops back. Breach? Are you insane? Jackson screamed, firing a blind burst over the barrier. That is a suicide run. It is not a request, Master Chief. It is a calculated trajectory. Trust the math or trust the grave. I have adjusted the satellite thermals. The door hinges are compromised. Kick it. Now. Jackson looked at his team, their faces smeared with soot and fear. He remembered the woman in the sterile fatigues he had laughed at yesterday. He remembered the generals saluting her. He swallowed his pride along with the blood in his mouth. Viper 1 moving to breach, Jackson growled, rising into the hail of bullets. If you are wrong, lady, I am haunting you. I am never wrong about the geometry of death, Jackson. Go. 36. Hours earlier, forward operating base Iron Horse, unidentified location in the Hindu Kush. The transport plane, a bloated gray C-130 Hercules, slammed its tires onto the cracked runway of forward operating base Iron Horse. The impact shuddered through the airframe, waking the few dozing soldiers strapped into the web seating. But Elena Vance had not been sleeping. She had been staring at the rivet pattern on the bulkhead opposite her for 4 hours, her mind already constructing three-dimensional maps of a valley she had not yet seen with her own eyes. When the ramp lowered, the heat hit them first, a physical wall of dry, dusty air that smelled of burnt diesel and ancient sand. Elena unbuckled her harness. She carried no rucksack, only a slim, hard-shell tactical case locked to her left wrist. She wore desert fatigues, but they were scrubbed clean of any name tapes, rank insignia, or unit patches. To the uninitiated, she looked like a civilian contractor or perhaps a bureaucratic error. She stepped onto the tarmac, her boots making no sound against the roar of the engines. The base was a hive of controlled chaos. Forklifts beeped incessantly, moving pallets of ammunition. Mechanics shouted over the whine of power tools, and heavily armed patrols moved in phalanxes toward the perimeter walls. "Hold it right there!" A military police corporal stepped into her path, his hand resting instinctively on his holstered sidearm. He was young, sunburned, and clearly agitated by the influx of personnel for the upcoming operation. This area is restricted to active combat personnel and clearance level 3 and above. I need to see ID and orders, ma'am. He emphasized the word ma'am with a mixture of confusion and dismissal, his eyes scanning her small frame and lack of rank. In this world of bearded giants and heavy ordnance, she was an anomaly. Elena didn't speak. She didn't even slow down. She simply raised her left wrist, turning the face of her digital watch toward the corporal's handheld scanner. Beep! The scanner let out a sharp, high-pitched tone that the corporal had likely never heard before. He looked down at the screen, and his face went pale. The display didn't show a name or a rank. It flashed a single, blinking red code. Blacklight. Access granted. Do not detain. The corporal swallowed hard, stepping aside so quickly he almost tripped over his own boots. Apologies, go ahead. Elena passed him without a glance, her expression unchanged. She wasn't arrogant. She was simply efficient. Every second spent explaining herself was a second taken away from the mission parameters. She navigated through the maze of blast walls and tents toward the main Tactical Operations Center, TOC. The base was vibrating with testosterone and adrenaline. She could feel the eyes of passing soldiers on her, curiosity, skepticism, and the inevitable judgment. She was a woman in a sterile uniform walking alone into the heart of the beast. They saw a target for ridicule. She saw assets to be managed. She reached the heavy steel door of the TOC. Two Marines with M4 carbines guarded the entrance. They saw the black clearance badge she pulled from her pocket and opened the door without a word, though they exchanged a confused look as she passed. Inside, the air was conditioned and smelled of stale coffee and ozone. The hum of servers and the low murmur of radio operators replaced the external noise. In the center of the room stood the massive situational table, the altar of modern warfare. Elena walked to the edge of the room, finding a shadow near a bank of monitors. She set her case down and waited. The players were about to arrive, and she needed to see the board before she moved her pieces. She was the ghost in the machine, and for now, she preferred it that way. The mess hall at Forward Operating Base Iron Horse was less a dining area and more a demilitarized zone for the world's most lethal predators. The air hung heavy with the smell of rehydrated eggs, burned coffee, and the metallic tang of gun oil that seemed to seep from the pores of every man in the room. It was a cacophony of clattering trays and boisterous laughter, a wall of sound that insulated them from the silence of the desert outside. Master Chief Jackson moved through the crowd, like an icebreaker cutting through a frozen sea. Standing 6'4" with shoulders that strained the fabric of his combat shirt, he was a gravitational force. His beard was thick, flecked with premature gray, and his eyes were hard flints that missed nothing. Around him, the men of Viper Team fell into formation instinctively, their movements loose but coordinated. They claimed a long table near the center, displacing a few support staff who knew better than to argue with a Tier 1 operator holding a tray of meatloaf. Jackson dropped his tray with a deliberate clatter, claiming the territory. "Eat up, boys," Jackson growled, his voice a low rumble that cut through the ambient noise. "We drop in 48 hours. I don't want anyone passing out because they missed their calories." Across the aisle, a group of Delta Force operators were huddled over maps and coffee. One of them, a wiry man with a southern drawl named Miller, looked up and smirked. The rivalry between the Navy's SEALs and the Army's Delta was ancient, written in blood and bar fights across 3 continents. "Hey, Jackson," Miller called out, leaning back in his chair. "Word is Command is bringing in outside help for Obsidian Rain. You boys forget how to read a map again?" Laughter rippled through the Delta table. Jackson didn't even look up from his food, but the air around him tightened. He slowly chewed, swallowed, and then turned his gaze on Miller. It was a look that had made insurgents surrender without a shot fired. "We don't need maps to find the bad guys, Miller. We just follow the trail of gear you Army boys drop when you run away," Jackson shot back. The SEALs at his table roared, banging their fists on the metal surface. Miller's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed. "Joke all you want, Chief, but I saw the manifest. A single passenger arrived on the bird from Germany an hour ago. No rank, no unit patch, just a suitcase. Rumor says it's some civilian analyst from the Pentagon. Probably never held a rifle, but they are here to tell us how to kick doors." Jackson paused, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. The humor evaporated from his face. A civilian? on an op this black? Obsidian Rain was a direct action raid deep into hostile territory, a suicide run if the intel wasn't perfect. The idea of a bureaucrat with a spreadsheet dictating their movements was an insult to every scar on his body. A suit? Jackson repeated, the word tasting like bile. They are sending a suit to brief us? Not just brief, Miller added, dropping his voice conspiratorially. Direct command authority. That is the word. Jackson slammed his fork down, the metal tine bending against the tray. The chatter at his table died instantly. His men looked at him, gauging his reaction, waiting for the cue on how to feel. Jackson felt the heat rising in his neck. He had buried friends in sands like these because of decisions made in air-conditioned offices by people who thought war was a theory. This operation is kinetic, Jackson stated, his voice loud enough to be heard by the surrounding tables. We deal in lead and blood, not PowerPoint slides. If some pencil pusher thinks they can walk into my briefing and tell me how to run my team, they are going to learn a very hard lesson about the chain of command. He stood up, abandoning his half-eaten meal. The physical imposition of his height cast a shadow over the table. Where are they? Jackson asked, looking at Miller. War room, Miller replied, pointing a thumb toward the secure sector. Saw them go in 10 minutes ago. Jackson adjusted his belt, checking the placement of the knife at his hip out of habit. Then I think it is time we go introduce ourselves. I want to see what kind of genius thinks they can tell Viper Team how to fight. He marched toward the exit, his boots thudding rhythmically against the floor. His team scrambled to follow, abandoning their food. Jackson didn't look back, but his mind was already rehearsing the dressing down he was going to give this interloper. He would shame them, break them, and send them packing on the next flight out. No one disrespected his battlefield with incompetence. Not on his watch. The heavy steel door sealed behind Elena, cutting off the industrial noise of the outer corridor. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, the atmosphere shifted instantly from physical chaos to intellectual tension. The room was bathed in the sterile, low-temperature glow of LED monitors and tactical displays. It smelled of ozone, burnt coffee, and recycled air, a sharp, artificial contrast to the diesel fumes and dust outside. Rows of intelligence analysts sat hunched over workstations, their faces illuminated by streams of encrypted data, speaking in hushed tones into headsets. Elena moved through the gloom with practiced invisibility. She did not walk like a soldier on parade. She moved like a predator conserving energy. Her target was the large, rectangular table in the center of the pit, the Combined Arms sand table. It was a complex topography of the target valley, built from high-resolution LiDAR scans and updated in near real time. A few junior officers, mostly captains and majors, were gathered near a map board in the corner. Their conversation faltered as she passed. Eyes followed her, not with respect, but with the suspicious curiosity reserved for civilians in a combat zone. She could feel their silent questions hanging in the heavy air. Who is she? Why is she here? Elena ignored them completely. Her focus narrowed to the three-dimensional landscape before her. She stopped at the head of the table. The projection showed a rugged valley in the Hindu Kush, dominated by a fortress-like compound dug into the cliffside. This was the objective for Obsidian Rain. Red markers indicated known enemy positions. Blue markers showed the proposed insertion points for the SEALs and Delta operators. Elena leaned in, her hands resting on the edge of the table. Her eyes scanned the northern ridge. According to the current layout, the ridge was marked as a low-risk entry point, a blind spot in the enemy's defenses ideal for a silent approach. She frowned, slightly. It was a trap. Her mind replayed the raw thermal imaging data she had reviewed on her tablet during the flight over. The rock formation on that ridge wasn't natural. The heat signature was consistent with a camouflaged ventilation shaft for a subterranean bunker. If the teams inserted there, they would be walking directly on top of a heavy machine gun nest. Without hesitating, Elena reached onto the digital surface. Her fingers manipulated the holographic interface, dragging a red, heavy weapon icon from the sidebar and dropping it precisely onto the safe ridge. She then drew a jagged red line across the proposed extraction route, marking it as a kill zone. "Hey, you can't touch that!" A sharp voice barked from her left. A young army captain with a clipboard stepped forward, his brow furrowed in annoyance. "That layout is set by intelligence. You need authorization to alter the operational picture, ma'am. That data is finalized." Elena didn't look up. She adjusted the blast radius of the new threat marker, her fingers moving with the fluidity of a pianist. "The intelligence is 6 hours old, Captain. The thermal signatures changed at 0400. Unless you want your extraction team shredded by a 12.7mm DSHK, I suggest you leave it." The captain blinked, taken aback by the flat, absolute certainty in her voice. He opened his mouth to argue, to demand her credentials, but the words died in his throat. There was something in her posture, a stillness that felt more dangerous than aggression, that froze him. She didn't ask for permission. She simply corrected reality. Elena finished her adjustments. She straightened up, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her sleeve. The map now looked like a nightmare of red zones, but it was an honest nightmare. It was a map that gave them a chance of survival. The sound of the main blast doors opening shattered the quiet tension of the room. Heavy boots slammed against the floor, accompanied by the loud, aggressive energy of men who owned the space they walked in. "I don't care what the manifest says," a gravelly voice boomed, echoing off the metal walls. "This is my kill box." Elena turned slowly. Master Chief Jackson stood in the doorway, flanked by his team. He looked like a storm front rolling in, massive, angry, and looking for a lightning rod. His eyes swept the room and locked onto her, the only person standing at the head of his table, her hand still hovering over the map he was supposed to command. Master Chief Jackson did not just walk across the room. He annexed the floor space with every stride. The heavy thud of his combat boots on the linoleum acted as a metronome, silencing the murmurs of the analysts and junior officers. He moved with the kinetic aggression of a man who had spent the last decade kicking down doors and terrifying people for a living. His target was the small, unadorned figure standing at the head of the command table. His table. He stopped 2 feet from Elena, invading her personal space with deliberate menace. The physical disparity was comical. Jackson was a wall of muscle and ceramic armor, towering over her. Elena, in her plain fatigues, barely reached his chest. Yet, she did not step back. She did not even look up immediately, her eyes still tracing the red extraction line she had just drawn on the digital map. "You are lost," Jackson said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a tone that suggested her presence was a personal insult to the integrity of the mission. "The administrative offices are in the B block, next to the laundry. This is the war room. It requires a security clearance higher than your pay grade." Elena finally lifted her head. Her movement was slow, deliberate, devoid of the flinch response Jackson was accustomed to provoking. Her eyes were a pale, unsettling gray, and for a split second, Jackson felt as if he were being scanned by a targeting computer, rather than looked at by a human being. "I am aware of my location, Master Chief," Elena replied. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, forcing him to lean in slightly to hear her, a subtle power play that annoyed him instantly. "And I am aware of yours. You are currently standing on the wrong side of the briefing table." A ripple of nervous energy went through the room. The young captain with the clipboard took a step back, sensing the blast radius. Jackson's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck cording. He wasn't used to pushback, certainly not from civilians, and definitely not from women who looked like they belonged in a library rather than a forward operating base. He leaned down, placing his knuckles on the edge of the digital table, looming over her. "Listen to me, lady. I have 18 men outside checking their gear. 18 men who are going to trust me with their lives tonight. I don't have time to babysit contractors or Pentagon observers who want to play soldier." He gestured vaguely at her sterile uniform. "You don't have a name tape. You don't have a rank. To me that means you don't exist. And if you don't exist, you don't get to see my intel." Elena remained impassive. She didn't blink. She didn't justify herself. She simply watched him, her expression reading as a mixture of boredom and clinical detachment. It was the look a surgeon might give a malfunctioning scalpel, not angry, just disappointed in the tool's performance. This silence infuriated Jackson more than any shout could have. He needed a reaction. He needed to re-establish the hierarchy of the jungle he ruled. He straightened up, letting out a short, derisive laugh that echoed in the quiet room. He pointed a thick, calloused finger toward the far corner of the toque, where a small break area was set up. "Tell you what," Jackson announced, his voice booming so every analyst in the room could hear. "Since you are here, make yourself useful. The coffee machine is over there. The filters are tricky. Why don't you go, figure that out while the adults talk strategy? Black, no sugar. That is an order." The room went deathly silent. The hum of the servers seemed to grow louder. The young captain looked at the floor, embarrassed. This was beyond professional friction. It was a public dressing down designed to humiliate. Elena looked at the coffee machine, then back at Jackson. She didn't redden with shame. She didn't stammer. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, cold, sharp, and terrifyingly calm. "I don't take orders from you, Jackson," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And I don't make coffee. I make plans. Now step back. You are blocking the satellite feed." Jackson's face darkened, the blood rushing to his cheeks. He took a breath to unleash a tirade that would peel the paint off the walls, his hand moving instinctively to point at the door. The air in the room crackled, a fuse burning down to the powder keg. Jackson did not back down. Instead, a cold, predatory amusement settled over his features. If intimidation wouldn't work, humiliation would. He decided to dismantle her intellectually, piece by piece, until she fled the room in tears. He stepped around the corner of the table, closing the distance until he was whispering directly into her ear, though his voice carried enough projection for the entire room to serve as his audience. "You make plans," Jackson repeated, tasting the words like spoiled milk. "All right, let's talk plans. Let's talk about the reality of what happens when your little lines on a map turn into hot lead." He gestured broadly to the room, where the younger analysts were now watching with bated breath, unable to look away from the slow-motion train wreck. "Tell me, Planner," Jackson said, his tone dripping with mock curiosity. What is the effective engagement range of a suppressed HK-416 with subsonic ammunition against level 4 ceramic body armor? Do you factor that into your spreadsheets? Or do you just assume the bad guys fall down because the paper says they should? Elena did not answer. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She looked at Jackson, but she looked through him. To her, he was currently just noise, a variable in the equation that was creating unnecessary friction. She knew the answer was less than 100 meters for reliable penetration, and even that was optimistic, depending on the angle of incidence. But she also knew that answering him would validate his authority to question her. Silence, Jackson sneered, mistaking her discipline for ignorance. Just as I thought. You read a few field manuals, watched a few movies, and now you think you understand the geometry of a kill house. He circled her like a shark. How about windage? We are dropping into a valley with unpredictable thermal updrafts. If my sniper has to take a shot at 800 meters with a 338 Lapua, and there is a 12-knot crosswind coming off that ridge, how many mils does he hold? Do you even know what a milliradian is? Or do you think it is a type of salad dressing? A few of the younger SEALs chuckled nervously behind him. It was a brutal display. A veteran operator bullying a civilian who clearly had no business in the deep end of the pool. Elena remained a statue. Internally, she checked the internal clock in her head. The council was scheduled to arrive in exactly 45 seconds. She felt a twinge of pity for Jackson. His arrogance was a shield, a necessary armor for the horrors of his job, but tonight it had blinded him. He was fighting a war for dominance in a room where the hierarchy had already been decided weeks ago in the Pentagon. Jackson, emboldened by her lack of response, leaned over the sand table again. He tapped the holographic ridgeline she had marked earlier with his thick finger. "Look at this," he scoffed, shaking his head. "You are staring at this map like you can read the terrain. I bet you don't even know which way north is without a compass. You see a mountain. I see cover. You see a valley. I see a fatal funnel. You are playing a video game, lady. But when the shooting starts, there is no reset button for my men." He straightened up, his chest swelling with the triumph of having silenced the intruder. He opened his mouth to deliver the final blow, to order her out of his war room once and for all. "Get out," Jackson growled, pointing to the door. "Before I have the MPs drag you." Crash. The double doors at the main entrance didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a force that rattled the frames. The sudden noise cut through Jackson's tirade like a guillotine. A thunderous voice, practiced on parade grounds and hardened in command centers, filled every cubic inch of the Tactical Operations Center. "Room, attention!" The command was absolute. It triggered a reflex ingrained in every soldier present. The chatter died instantly. Chairs scraped against the floor as analysts scrambled to their feet. Spines straightened, chins tucked, and heels clicked together in a single, unified crack that sounded like a gunshot. Jackson snapped to attention instinctively. His body reacted before his brain could process the interruption. He spun toward the door, his chest puffed out, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, ready to greet whatever high-ranking officer had arrived to validate his authority. He expected a colonel, maybe a one-star general coming to give the final green light. He was wrong. Through the doors walked 4 men. They moved with the heavy, inevitable gravity of history. Their uniforms were impeccable, and on each shoulder, 4 silver stars gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had arrived. The silence that descended upon the Tactical Operations Center was not merely the absence of noise, it was a physical weight, pressing down on the lungs of every man and woman in the room. The hum of the cooling fans seemed to vanish. The only sound remaining was the rhythmic, synchronized strike of polished dress shoes against the hard floor. 4 men walked abreast. They did not look left or right. They moved with the terrifying momentum of a glacier. At the center walked General Austin Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man whose face was etched into the history books of 3 different wars. Flanking him were the chiefs of the Army, the Air Force, and the Chief of Naval Operations. Between them, 16 silver stars caught the harsh overhead light, creating a constellation of authority that sucked the oxygen out of the room. Master Chief Jackson stood rigid, his heels locked, his hand snapping a crisp salute to his brow. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from a surge of vindictive adrenaline. This was it. The chain of command had arrived to restore order. He adjusted his posture, pushing his chest out further, ensuring his trident pin was visible. In Jackson's mind, the script was already written. General Thorne would stop in front of him. Jackson would bark his unit designation and readiness report. Thorne would nod, acknowledge the legendary Viper team, and then turn his steely gaze toward the civilian intruder standing disrespectfully at the head of the table. He would ask who she was, and when she failed to answer, she would be escorted out by the MPs, leaving the war to the warriors. Jackson held his breath as the phalanx of generals approached the sand table. He locked his eyes forward, staring at a point on the far wall, waiting for the inevitable pause in their stride that would signal his acknowledgement. "Here it comes," Jackson thought, a smug satisfaction curling in his gut. "Watch and learn, lady. This is what respect looks like." But the pause never came. General Thorne did not slow down. He did not turn his head toward the Master Chief. He did not return the salute. He did not even blink in Jackson's direction. To the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the legendary SEAL operator was nothing more than a piece of furniture, a decorative element of the room's architecture, invisible and irrelevant. The 4 men swept past Jackson with a gust of displaced air that smelled of starch and old leather. Jackson was forced to instinctively shrink back a fraction of an inch to avoid being physically brushed aside. His hand remained frozen at his brow, his salute unanswered, hanging in the air like a rejected offering. The shock hit him like a physical blow. His eyes widened, breaking discipline to track their movement. Confusion scrambled his thoughts. Did they not see me? Are they heading to the comms station? The generals stopped. They came to a halt in a precise line, shoulder to shoulder, directly in front of the small, unadorned woman standing at the head of the table. Elena had not moved. She had not come to attention. She stood relaxed, her hands still clasped behind her back, watching the most powerful men in the United States Armed Forces with the same calm, gray-eyed appraisal she had given the coffee machine earlier. The contrast was jarring. On one side, 4 giants of the military establishment, draped in medals and ribbons that chronicled decades of service. On the other, a solitary figure in plain fatigues, without a single patch to her name. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the explosion. Waiting for General Thorne to demand why this woman was not standing at attention. Jackson lowered his hand slowly, his mouth slightly open. He watched, waiting for the reprimand that would surely shatter her composure. He wanted to see her flinch. Instead, General Thorne shifted his stance. He squared his shoulders toward Elena, and then, with a snap that echoed like a whip crack in the silent room, The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff raised his hand. It was not a casual wave. It was a slow, deliberate, and fiercely respectful salute. A split second later, the other three generals followed suit. 4 hands raised in perfect unison. 4 pairs of eyes locked onto Elena with an intensity that bordered on reverence. They weren't saluting a superior officer. They were saluting something far rarer. Jackson felt the floor drop out from under him. The blood drained from his face, leaving him cold and dizzy. The world tilted. The logic of his universe, where rank was God and strength was king, dissolved in an instant. General Thorne lowered his hand, his voice breaking the silence, deep and resonant. "Madam Commander," Thorne said, the title hitting the room like a mortar shell. "The council is assembled. We await your orders." The word commander did not just hang in the air. It seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the Tactical Operations Center. It was a title that carried weight, but coming from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, addressed to a woman in unbranded fatigues, it felt like a violation of the laws of physics. Master Chief Jackson stood frozen, his arm slowly dropping to his side like a dead weight. His brain was misfiring, struggling to reconcile the data his eyes were feeding him with the reality he thought he knew. He had just ordered this woman to make coffee. He had mocked her understanding of ballistics. He had treated the architect of his mission like a confused secretary. The silence in the room was absolute. Every analyst, every junior officer, every hardened operator was staring at Elena Vance. They looked for a badge, a star, a hidden insignia that they had missed, something that would explain why 4 of the most powerful men on Earth were treating her like royalty. But there was nothing. Just the plain, dust-colored fabric and the calm, gray eyes. Elena did not flinch under the weight of the moment. She did not smile in triumph, nor did she gloat. Slowly, with a precision that betrayed decades of discipline, she raised her hand. Her salute was not the sharp, aggressive snap of a drill sergeant, but the fluid, perfectly angled motion of a veteran officer. "General Thorne," she said, her voice steady, lacking the tremor that anyone else would have had in her position. "At ease, gentlemen." The 4 generals dropped their salutes in unison, their movements synchronized as if by a single neural link. Their demeanor shifted from ceremonial respect to intense professional focus. They were not here to inspect the troops. They were here to work, and clearly, they were here to work for her. The Pentagon has reviewed the final simulations for Operation Obsidian Rain, General Thorne stated, his voice carrying to the back of the room. He ignored Jackson completely, treating him as an obstacle to be bypassed. "The President has signed off on your directive, Elena. The assets are yours. The timeline is yours. We are here to ensure your orders are executed without interference." Your orders. Jackson felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. The blood had drained from his face so completely that he felt lightheaded. The humiliation was not burning. It was freezing. It started in his gut and spread to his extremities. He had not just insulted a superior officer. He had insulted the Shadow Actual, the legendary classified designation for the strategic commanders who operated outside the public chain of command. These were the people who moved nations on a chessboard, while men like him were just the pawns. He looked at Elena, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the lines of exhaustion around her eyes that he had mistaken for weakness. He saw the calluses on her fingers. He saw the stillness of a predator that didn't need to roar to be dangerous. Elena nodded to the generals, accepting their report. Then, slowly, she turned her head. Her gaze swept past the terrified junior officers and locked onto Master Chief Jackson. He wanted to disappear. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He braced himself for the dressing down. She had every right to strip him of his command, to have him court-martialed for insubordination, or at the very least, to verbally flay him in front of his men. But Elena said nothing. She simply looked at him. Her expression was unreadable, neither angry nor vindictive. It was the look a teacher gives a student who has failed a test they didn't study for. It was a look of profound, crushing disappointment. She held his gaze for 3 long seconds, an eternity in the quiet room. Then, without a word, she turned her back on him. "Take your seats, gentlemen," Elena said to the generals, gesturing to the chairs surrounding the sand table. "We have 36 hours to neutralize a biological threat, and according to the Master Chief here, I need to learn how to read a map." The comment was delivered with such dry, flat delivery that it cut deeper than any shout could have. General Thorne shot a glance at Jackson, a look of terrifying scrutiny that promised a conversation later, before sitting down. Jackson stood alone in the middle of the room, isolated by his own arrogance. His team behind him shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his eyes. The dynamic of power had shifted so violently that the room felt tilted. Elena Vance was not the intruder. He was. The shift in the room was palpable. The moment the generals took their seats, the atmosphere transformed from a theater of humiliation into a cold, hard workshop of war. Elena Vance did not waste time basking in the authority that had just been handed to her. She stepped up to the sand table, her hands moving across the holographic interface with the fluency of a maestro conducting a symphony. "Gentlemen, look at the screen," Elena said. Her voice had changed. Gone was the soft, almost whisper-quiet tone she had used with Jackson. Now, it was deep, resonant, and projected with a command presence that filled the corners of the room. Intelligence confirms that the target compound is not just a storage facility. It is an active laboratory. They are 24 hours away from weaponizing a strain of aerosolized anthrax that defies current vaccination protocols. A murmur rippled through the gathered officers. The stakes had just escalated from a standard capture-kill mission to a catastrophic global threat. "The valley is covered by a network of S-400 surface-to-air missile batteries," Elena continued, highlighting the red zones on the map. "Air support is impossible until those batteries are neutralized. That means the initial insertion must be a ghost run. No birds, no drones, no noise." She looked up, scanning the faces of the unit commanders. Her eyes stopped briefly on Master Chief Jackson, who was standing rigidly at the back, his face a mask of conflict. "We will insert 2 teams via high-altitude jump, 30 miles out," Elena explained, tracing the flight path. "You will glide under the radar floor and hike the remaining distance over the Zagros peaks. It is a 12-hour movement in sub-zero temperatures with full combat loads." One of the Delta Force majors raised a hand. "Commander, with all due respect, that terrain is impassable at night. The risk of losing operators to the environment before we even reach the target is over 40%. I have calculated the attrition rates, Major," Elena replied, her voice devoid of emotion. "The path I have charted follows the thermal vents along the ridgeline. It will mask your heat signatures from enemy patrols and keep you warm enough to survive. It is not impassable. It is just difficult. And I assume," she paused, glancing at the seals, "that difficulty is why you are here." The room went silent. She was not just giving orders. She was challenging their elite status. She was using their own pride as leverage. Then came the turning point. Elena zoomed in on the northern gate of the compound, the most heavily defended point on the map. It was a kill box, a suicide run for anyone foolish enough to knock on the front door. "I need a diversion here," Elena said, pointing to the gate. "I need a team to make enough noise to convince the enemy that the entire U.S. military is coming through the front door. This team will draw fire from 3 heavy machine gun nests and a mechanized infantry platoon. They will be outnumbered 10-1. She looked up from the glowing map and locked eyes with Master Chief Jackson. The room held its breath. Everyone expected her to assign this suicide mission to a support unit, or perhaps give it to another team to spare Jackson the glory, or worse, assign Jackson to guard the perimeter in the rear as punishment for his earlier insolence. "Master Chief Jackson," Elena said clearly. Jackson straightened, bracing himself. "Ma'am." "Viper team has the lead," Elena declared. "You are the hammer. You will hit that gate with everything you have. You need to hold their attention for exactly 14 minutes while Delta breaches the lab from the rear. If you break contact early, Delta dies. If you fail to draw their fire, the mission fails. Can you handle the pressure, Master Chief?" It was not a question of ability. It was a test of character. She was entrusting him with the most dangerous, critical component of her plan. She was putting the lives of the entire operation in the hands of the man who had just mocked her. Jackson felt a surge of complex emotions: shame, gratitude, and a fierce, burning resolve. She wasn't petty. She was professional. She recognized that despite his arrogance, he was the best sledgehammer she had. "Viper team is ready, Commander," Jackson replied, his voice thick with newfound respect. "We will hold the line?" "Good," Elena said, cutting him off before he could say more. She turned back to the generals. "General Thorne, I need the communication satellites realigned to this grid by 0200 hours. We launch at 0300. "Consider it done," Thorne said, standing up. "Dismissed," Elena announced. The room broke into organized chaos as officers rushed to brief their squads. Jackson lingered for a moment, watching Elena. He wanted to approach her, to say something, an apology, an acknowledgement, anything to bridge the gap he had created. He took a step forward, but Elena did not look up. She was already deep into the next layer of data, her face illuminated by the blue light of the map, her mind already fighting the war that was yet to come. To her, Jackson was already deployed. The time for talking was over. The team room was usually a sanctuary of loud music and profane banter, a place where adrenaline was managed through aggressive humor. Tonight, however, it was a mausoleum. The only sounds were the mechanical clicks of magazines being seated, the rip of Velcro patches, and the slide of heavy bolts being function-checked. Master Chief Jackson stood at his locker, staring at the worn reflection in the small steel mirror taped to the door. He didn't like what he saw. He saw a man who had let his ego write checks his rank couldn't cash. Behind him, the men of Viper Team were gearing up in silence. They weren't looking at him, and that was worse than if they were shouting. They had seen their leader dismantled without a single shot being fired, and the foundation of their unit's invincibility felt cracked. "Check your plates," Jackson murmured, breaking the silence. His voice sounded rusty. "If I see a loose strap on the flight line, you are staying behind." "Hoo-yah, Chief," came the muttered automatic replies. Across the room, the Delta operators were already painting their faces. Miller, the operator Jackson had confronted in the mess hall, caught his eye. There was no smirk this time, just a grim nod. The mission parameters Elena had laid out scared everyone enough to erase the petty rivalries. They were all walking into the fire together. Jackson picked up his HK-416 rifle. He cycled the action, feeling the smooth, oiled resistance of the mechanism. He checked his optics, his laser designator, and his suppressor. The physical ritual of preparing for violence grounded him. It was simple. Iron and lead didn't care about rank or politics. He moved to the communications rack to grab his MBITR radio. This was the lifeline. In the mountains of the Hindu Kush, if you lost comms, you were just a corpse waiting to be found. He stopped. Someone was already there. Elena Vance stood at the workbench, illuminated by the harsh light of a soldering lamp. She had the casing of a radio open, her small fingers manipulating the delicate internal wiring with a pair of fine tweezers. She wasn't wearing the tactical heavy armor the rest of them were struggling into. She was still in her plain fatigues, looking dangerously fragile amidst the piles of lethal hardware. Jackson hesitated. Part of him wanted to turn around and grab a spare from the crate, but the soldier in him knew better. He stepped forward. "That is my radio, Commander," Jackson said, his tone respectful, stripped of the earlier arrogance. Elena didn't jump. She finished a connection, snapped the casing shut, and screwed it tight before turning to face him. She held the black brick of electronics out to him. "I know," Elena said. "I swapped the encryption module. The standard NSA keys are compromised in this sector. I wrote a custom rolling algorithm for your team. It shifts frequency 400 times a second. The Russians won't be able to jam it, and they definitely won't be able to listen." Jackson took the radio. It felt heavier, though he knew that was just psychological. She had been working on this while he was sulking. She had been ensuring his survival while he was questioning her competence. The shame twisted in his gut again. "Commander," Jackson started, struggling to find the words. "About earlier. In the Toast Sea, I was out of line. Way out." Elena watched him, her expression softening just a fraction. She leaned back against the workbench, crossing her arms. "You were protecting your men, Jackson. You thought I was a risk factor. I don't need your apology. I need your obedience when the bullets start flying. Can you give me that?" "You have it," Jackson said, meeting her eyes. 100%. Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, flat object no larger than a matchbox. It was matte black, with no markings. She pressed it into Jackson's hand, her fingers brushing against his calloused palm. "Take this," she ordered. "Put it in your boot, inside the lining, not on your vest." Jackson turned the device over. "What is it? A secondary beacon?" "It is a ghost link," Elena replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It bypasses the satellite network entirely. If everything goes wrong, if the radio fails, if the team is scattered, if I lose you on the main grid, this will tell me where you are. But it only works if you are alive to generate the body heat to power it." She looked at him with an intensity that chilled him. It was the look of someone who had lost people before and refused to lose anyone tonight. "Do not die, Master Chief," Elena said, turning back to her equipment. "I hate filling out paperwork." Jackson gripped the small device tight. He nodded, even though she wasn't looking, and shoved it deep into his boot. For the first time all day, he didn't feel like the smartest man in the room. But as he walked out to the tarmac where the C-130s were waiting, engines turning over in the dark, he felt something more important. He felt commanded. The ramp of the C-130 Hercules lowered slowly, revealing a rectangular maw of absolute darkness. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin enough to kill and cold enough to freeze sweat instantly inside a flight suit. Master Chief Jackson stood at the edge of the abyss, the wind roaring like a physical assault against his oxygen mask. Behind him, the members of Viper Team were ghostly silhouettes bathed in the dim red tactical lights of the cargo bay. They were laden with equipment, rucksacks, weapons cases, and the heavy parachutes required for a high-altitude, low-opening jump. There was no banter now. There was only the rhythmic hiss of oxygen regulators and the internal countdown each man was running in his head. "Green light in 5 seconds!" the jumpmaster shouted over the intercom, holding up 5 gloved fingers. Jackson checked his altimeter one last time. They were dropping into the void, aiming for a narrow saddle between 2 jagged peaks in the Zagros Mountains. It was a needle-threading exercise performed in pitch blackness. The light on the bulkhead turned from red to green. Jackson stepped off the ramp. The exit was violent. The slipstream caught him, tumbling him into the freezing vacuum before he stabilized into a spread eagle freefall. The roar of the engines faded, replaced by the rushing wind. He fell for 2 minutes, plummeting through the cloud layer like a stone dropped into a well. At 4,000 feet above ground level, he pulled his ripcord. The chute deployed with a sharp crack that jerked his harness tight against his thighs. Silence returned. Jackson steered his canopy, scanning the ground through his panoramic night vision goggles. The world below was a monochrome landscape of jagged green cliffs and bottomless valleys. He spotted the infrared strobe marking the landing zone, a small, flat patch of rock barely large enough for the team to regroup. He flared his canopy and hit the ground hard, rolling to disperse the impact. He cut away the chute immediately, burying it under a pile of loose shale as per protocol. Within minutes, Viper Team had assembled. They were ghosts in the mountains, invisible and silent. "Check in," Jackson whispered into his microphone. "Viper 2 up. Viper 3 up. Viper 4 up." The head count was perfect, but the hard part had just begun. Elena Vance had charted a route that followed a series of geothermal vents along the ridgeline to mask their thermal signatures from enemy drones. It was a brilliant plan on paper, but on the ground, it was hell. The terrain was steep, covered in loose scree that threatened to send them sliding into the ravine with every step. They moved for 3 hours. The cold was biting, seeping through their layers, but the heat from the vents provided brief, sulfur-smelling pockets of warmth. Jackson took the point position, his rifle raised, scanning the path ahead. The isolation was total. They were miles from support, deep in enemy territory, where a single broken ankle meant death. As they neared the crest of the ridge that overlooked the target valley, Jackson felt a prickle of unease. The terrain didn't match the old satellite maps he had memorized years ago. There was a rock outcropping ahead that looked too symmetrical, too perfect. He raised his fist, signaling the team to halt. He crouched low, blending into the shadows. Through his green-tinted vision, the path looked clear. There were no heat signatures, no movement. He told himself he was being paranoid. The intel report said this ridge was unmanned because of the harsh conditions. Jackson prepared to signal the advance. He shifted his weight to take the next step around the blind corner of the rock face. "Halt!" The voice cracked inside his earpiece, clear as a bell. It was Elena. Jackson froze mid-step, his boot hovering inches above the gravel. "Do not move, Viper 1. Elena's voice continued, calm and devoid of static. "Adjust your gaze 10 degrees right. Elevation 2 meters. Look for the heat shimmer." Jackson frowned behind his mask, but obeyed. He adjusted the focus on his night vision goggles, squinting at the rock face he had thought was empty. Slowly, a shape resolved itself from the background radiation. It wasn't a rock. It was a thermal blanket, expertly camouflaged, hiding a small dugout. Through a tiny gap in the fabric, he saw the faint, rhythmic puff of warm air, the breath of a sentry sleeping on duty. He was less than 5 feet from walking directly into the barrel of a concealed machine gun. Jackson slowly pulled his foot back, his heart hammering against his ribs. If he had taken that step, the crunch of gravel would have woken the guard. The mission would have ended in a firefight before they even saw the target. "Target identified," Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible. "Sentry. Concealed." "Bypass him," Elena ordered. "Go high. There is a ledge 3 meters above you. It will hold your weight." Jackson looked up. It looked impossibly narrow, but he didn't question her. Not anymore. He signaled his team to climb. As he pulled himself up the rock face, silently passing directly over the sleeping enemy, he realized that the device in his boot and the voice in his ear were the only things keeping them alive. She was watching over them like a guardian angel made of algorithms and steel. The descent from the ridge was a silent nightmare. Viper team moved like oil spilling down the mountainside, their boots finding purchase on the treacherous shale with practiced ease. Below them, the target compound glowed like a radioactive sore in the darkness of the valley. Floodlights swept the perimeter, and the hum of industrial generators drifted up on the wind. Master Chief Jackson signaled the halt 50 meters from the main gate. This was the choke point. According to Elena's plan, they were to initiate contact here, a loud, violent diversion to draw the enemy's eye, while Delta Force breached the laboratory ventilation shafts on the far side of the mountain. "Set charges," Jackson whispered. 2 of his men moved forward, placing linear-shaped charges on the outer blast wall. They retreated, counting down on their fingers. 3, 2, 1. The explosion was not a dull thud. It was a chest-compressing slam that shattered the silence of the valley. Concrete turned to dust. The heavy steel gates groaned and twisted off their hinges. "Contact! Contact front!" Jackson roared, abandoning stealth. Viper teams surged forward, their weapons cycling rapidly. For the first 30 seconds, it was a textbook assault. They dropped the perimeter guards with precise double taps before the enemy could raise their rifles. They pushed into the courtyard, seeking cover behind a row of concrete barriers. Then, the trap sprang. It didn't start with a shout, but with the terrifying, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a heavy-caliber weapon. From the hardened bunkers flanking the inner sanctum, muzzle flashes erupted like strobe lights. "Ambush! Take cover!" Jackson screamed, diving behind a pile of rubble just as the air where his head had been was occupied by 12.7mm rounds. The concrete barrier in front of him disintegrated under the impact. The enemy wasn't just returning fire. They were pouring a wall of lead into the courtyard. A rocket-propelled grenade hissed through the air and detonated against the wall behind them, showering the team in shrapnel and dust. "Man down! Viper 3 is hit!" someone yelled over the comms. Jackson scrambled to check his flank. They were pinned. The geometry of the courtyard was a kill box. The enemy had cross-firing angles that covered every inch of open ground. This was not the light security detail intelligence had predicted weeks ago. This was a mechanized battalion lying in wait. Jackson grabbed his radio, his hand shaking with the adrenaline of imminent death. He needed the sky to rain fire, or they were all going home in flag-draped boxes. "Command, this is Viper 1. We are taking heavy fire. We need immediate close air support on my coordinates." Danger close! Static hissed in his ear. Then, the voice of the Joint Terminal Attack Controller came back, sounding distant and helpless. Negative, Viper 1. Airspace is red. I repeat, airspace is red. We cannot clear the S-400 batteries. We are going to die down here, Jackson roared, firing a blind burst over the barrier to suppress the enemy machine gun. It had no effect. The thump, thump, thump continued, chipping away at their cover. He looked at his men. They were huddled low, eyes wide, waiting for him to save them. But he had no moves left. The book of tactics he had memorized for 20 years had run out of pages. There was no flanking route, no air support, and no retreat. Then his earpiece clicked. A new voice cut through the chaos, calm, feminine, and terrifyingly clear. Viper 1, status report. You are drifting off the kill box. It was Elena. She sounded as if she were sitting in a library, not monitoring a massacre. Jackson spat out grit, pressing his back harder against the crumbling cover. The sound of her voice triggered a memory of the map in the warm, safe Tactical Operations Center. Shadow Actual, we are pinned! Jackson shouted, his voice cracking with the strain. Intel was wrong. There is a mechanized battalion sitting on the extraction point. We need air support now. Negative on air support, Viper 1, Elena replied instantly. The airspace is contested by S-400 batteries. If I send birds in, they die. You have 30 seconds to breach the northern heavy door before the patrol loops back. Breach? Are you insane? Jackson screamed, staring at the heavy iron door across the courtyard. The space between him and that door was being chewed up by heavy machine gun fire. That is a suicide run. It is not a request, Master Chief. It is a calculated trajectory. Elena's voice was relentless, an anchor in the storm. Trust the math or trust the grave. I have adjusted the satellite thermals. The door hinges are compromised. Kick it. Now. Jackson looked at the door. He looked at the tracers tearing up the night. And then he remembered the look in her eyes when she gave him the tracker. She wasn't guessing. She had already played this scenario out 1,000 times in her head. He had to choose. Die here behind this rock, or die trying to follow the orders of the woman he had mocked. Jackson tightened his grip on his rifle. He swallowed the blood in his mouth. Viper 1. Moving to breach, he growled. If you are wrong, lady, I am haunting you. I am never wrong about the geometry of death, Jackson. Go. Jackson hit the heavy steel door with his shoulder, putting every ounce of his 200-pound frame into the impact. He expected resistance, a bone-jarring halt that would leave him exposed to the machine gun fire shredding the air behind him. Instead, the metal groaned and buckled inward. The hinges, compromised exactly as Elena had predicted by thermal stress or sabotage, sheared off. He tumbled into the darkness of the interior corridor, scrambling to his feet before the dust had even settled. His team poured in behind him, a frantic cascade of bodies and gear seeking refuge from the kill zone outside. Clear left! Clear right! Hold fire! Elena's voice cut through their heavy breathing. Switch to thermal. The dust will blind your night vision, but the enemy is waiting in the atrium. 3 targets. 2 standing, 1 prone behind the reception desk. Jackson didn't hesitate. He flipped his optics down, the world shifting from green phosphor to the monochromatic blue and white of thermal imaging. Through the thick cloud of pulverized concrete, he saw the heat signatures glowing bright white. 3 figures waiting in ambush 20 meters ahead. They were blind in the dust, firing wildly toward the door. Execute, Jackson whispered. 3 suppressed shots coughed from the team's rifles. The heat signatures crumpled to the floor instantly. Move up, Elena commanded. Do not stop. You have 90 seconds before the quick reaction force reinforces the southern stairwell. Take the service elevator shaft. It is disabled, but the cables are intact. Jackson led the sprint down the hallway, stepping over the bodies of the men they had just killed. The reliance on Elena was total now. She wasn't just reading a map. She was practically walking beside them, seeing what they couldn't see, hearing what they couldn't hear. They reached the elevator shaft. Jackson pried the doors open. The shaft was a gaping black mouth going up. Climb, Elena ordered. Second floor. Breach the drywall on the north side. It will put you directly behind the DSHK nest that pinned you. Jackson grabbed the grease-slicked cable and began to haul himself up. His muscles burned, screaming for oxygen, but his mind was singularly focused on the voice in his ear. It was a surreal experience. Outside, the war was a cacophony of explosions and shouting. Inside his helmet, it was a quiet, sterile lecture on geometry and timing. They reached the second floor. One of the SEALs used a sledgehammer to smash through the drywall. They stepped out into a darkened storage room that smelled of old paper and rat droppings. "Stop!" Elena said sharply. Jackson froze, his fist raised, the entire team locked up. "Patrol passing in the corridor. 3 men. Let them pass." Jackson held his breath. Through the thin wood of the door, he heard the heavy footsteps of boots on tile, the murmur of foreign voices, and the clinking of gear. They were inches away. If he had moved a second sooner, they would have walked right into a firefight they weren't ready for. The footsteps faded. "Clear," Elena said. "Go now. The machine gun nest is through the double doors at the end of the hall. You have the element of surprise." Viper team moved with the fluid lethality of apex predators. They stacked up on the double doors. Jackson didn't need to give orders. His men knew the drill. They breached. The scene inside was chaotic. 3 enemy gunners were focused on the courtyard below, their heavy machine gun hammering away at the empty space where Viper team had been moments ago. They were so fixated on the kill box that they never heard death coming from behind. Jackson raised his rifle. "Good night." The room erupted in controlled violence. Within seconds, the threats were neutralized. The deafening thump, thump, thump of the heavy gun fell silent. Jackson walked to the window, looking down at the carnage in the courtyard below. From this vantage point, he could see the trap that had been laid for them. It was perfect. Without Elena's intervention, they would be dead meat down there. He keyed his mic, his hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash. "Shadow Actual, this is Viper 1. The nest is clear. We have control of the gate." "Copy, Viper 1, Elena replied. Her voice didn't waver, didn't show relief. It remained the same cool, detached instrument of command. "Do not get comfortable. Delta has commenced their breach. You need to hold that position for 12 minutes. The entire base is waking up, and they know exactly where you are." Jackson looked at his men. They were alive. They were breathing. He checked the small device in his boot, feeling its pressure against his ankle. He realized then that the true hero of this operation wasn't the man pulling the trigger. It was the woman playing chess in the dark. "We are digging in," Jackson said. "Guide us home, Commander." "Time is up, Viper 1. Collapse the perimeter. Move to extraction point Alpha." Elena's command came precisely at the 14-minute mark. It was not a suggestion. The sheer volume of enemy fire impacting the walls around them had transitioned from sporadic suppression to a concentrated deluge. The element of surprise had evaporated, replaced by the angry swarm of a fully alerted garrison. "Viper team moving!" Jackson yelled, signaling his men. "Pop smoke! Bounding overwatch, go!" 2 canisters of green smoke hissed across the courtyard, creating a thick, artificial fog. Under its cover, the team abandoned the heavy machine gun nest they had captured. They moved in pairs, one element laying down rapid suppressive fire while the other sprinted 50 meters to the next cover. It was a brutal, lung-burning dance of violence executed on the edge of exhaustion. They breached the rear wall of the compound, spilling out onto the rocky slope that led down to the dry riverbed where the extraction helicopter was scheduled to land. But as they cleared the smoke, the sky above them remained dark. "Command? Where is our ride?" Jackson shouted into the radio, his chest heaving. "We are at the LZ, but I don't hear rotors." "Extraction bird is holding 5 miles out." The pilot's voice crackled over the net, sounding strained. "Viper 1, your LZ is too hot. I have multiple ZU-23 anti-aircraft guns tracking the valley floor. If I come down there, I am a burning wreck. I am waving off." "You cannot wave off!" Jackson screamed, looking back at the compound. A convoy of enemy trucks was already pouring out of the main gate, headlights sweeping the darkness, hunting them. "We are black on ammo and we have casualties walking. If you leave us, we are dead." "I am sorry, Viper 1. Orders are to preserve the airframe. I cannot land under heavy fire." Despair, cold and heavy, settled in Jackson's gut. This was it. The classic tragedy of special operations, abandoned on the ground because the risk to the hardware was too high. He looked at his men. They were kneeling behind rocks, changing their last magazines. They knew. He could see it in their eyes. Then, the calm voice returned. "Pilot, this is Shadow Actual," Elena said. "Maintain your approach vector. The anti-aircraft guns will be neutralized in 10 seconds. "Command, I don't see any friendly air support," the pilot argued. "There is nothing on the radar." "I did not say air support," Elena replied. "Jackson, keep your heads down." Jackson instinctively threw himself flat against the gravel. "Get down." 10 seconds. 5 miles to the east, on a completely different mountain peak, a massive explosion tore the night apart. It was not a missile strike. It was a fuel depot detonation so large it turned the sky orange. The shockwave rolled through the valley seconds later, shaking the ground beneath them. The enemy convoy halted. The anti-aircraft guns swiveled wildly away from the riverbed, tracking the massive fireball that had just erupted on their flank. The confusion was total. They thought the main attack was coming from the east. "Diversion active," Elena stated simply. "I hacked the pressure valves on their reserve fuel lines 3 hours ago. The sensors just redlined. The enemy is now blind and deaf. Pilot, your window is open. Land now." Jackson stared at the burning horizon. She had planned this. Before they had even boarded the plane in Germany, she had already rigged the battlefield to save them. She hadn't just reacted to the emergency. She had engineered the solution before the problem even existed. The heavy thrum of rotor blades beat against the air. A MH-47 Chinook roared over the ridge, coming in low and fast, its ramp already lowered. "Go, go, go!" Jackson hauled a wounded teammate to his feet, shoving him toward the waiting aircraft. The team scrambled up the ramp, collapsing onto the metal floor of the helicopter. The crew chief opened up with the minigun, spraying a final line of tracers at the confused enemy forces in the distance. But it wasn't necessary. The enemy was too busy fighting the inferno Elena had ignited. As the Chinook lifted off, banking hard to escape the valley, Jackson sat near the ramp. He removed his helmet, wiping the mixture of sweat, dirt, and blood from his face. He looked out at the receding battleground. The compound was a distant cluster of sparks, but the diversionary fire still raged on the eastern peak, a testament to the architect's reach. He reached down to his boot, feeling the hard lump of the tracker she had given him. It wasn't just a tracker. It was a promise kept. "Shadow Actual," Jackson said into his headset, his voice hoarse. "We are wheels up. All souls accounted for." "Copy that, Viper 1, Elena replied. "Good work. Get some sleep. I will see you on the deck." The line clicked dead. No speeches, no celebration. Just the job, done right. Jackson leaned his head back against the vibrating fuselage and closed his eyes, a profound sense of humility washing over him. He had thought he was the weapon. He realized now he was just the bullet. She was the one aiming the gun. The flight back to forward operating base Iron Horse was a blur of vibration and exhaustion. When the wheels of the Chinook finally touched down on the tarmac, the sun was just beginning to bleach the eastern horizon, turning the black sky into a bruised purple. The ramp lowered, and the men of Viper Team walked off not as the swaggering titans who had left 12 hours ago, but as men who had stared into the abyss and been pulled back by a thread. They moved to the decontamination zone, a sterile tent where they stripped off their gear. The ritual was mechanical. Armor plates clattered into bins. Weapons were cleared, magazines out, bolts locked back, chambers inspected. The smell of the mission, cordite, sweat, ancient dust, and fear, clung to their skin. Master Chief Jackson stood under the harsh spray of the field shower, watching the grime swirl down the drain. The hot water stung the fresh cuts on his arms, but he barely felt it. His mind was still in the valley, replaying the sequence of events. The impossible door breach, the hidden machine gun nest, the explosion on the eastern peak. Every single moment of their survival had been engineered by a woman he had sent to make coffee. He dressed in fresh utilities, the fabric feeling unnaturally light without the 40 pounds of ceramic armor. Most of his men were heading straight to their racks to pass out, but Jackson couldn't sleep. There was a knot in his chest that wouldn't loosen. It wasn't trauma. It was an unpaid debt. He needed to find her. He needed to look her in the eye and acknowledge that she was the operator of the day. Jackson walked across the base. The morning activity was picking up, but it felt distant, trivial compared to the silence of the high mountains. He headed straight for the Tactical Operations Center. The heavy steel door that he had barged through yesterday seemed more imposing now. The guard checked his ID and let him pass. Inside, the war room was still humming. Shifts had changed. New analysts were sipping fresh coffee, staring at new problems on the screens. But the atmosphere was different. The tension of Obsidian Rain had evaporated, replaced by the mundane grind of occupation. Jackson walked to the sand table. It was cleared. The holographic map of the valley was gone, replaced by a logistical supply route grid for a different sector. The spot where Elena had stood, where the generals had saluted her, was empty. He felt a pang of disappointment. He had expected to find her there, perhaps reviewing the after-action report, waiting for the accolades. He wanted to see her receive the credit she deserved. "Looking for someone, Master Chief?" Jackson turned. It was the young army captain with the clipboard, the one who had tried to stop Elena from touching the map yesterday. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes. "Commander Vance," Jackson said. "Is she in debriefing? I need a word." The captain shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. You won't find her in debriefing, Chief. She doesn't do victory laps. She uploaded the mission logs to the Pentagon server 20 minutes ago and handed back her clearance badge. So she is at the barracks? Jackson asked. No. The captain checked his watch. She is on the flight line. There is a gray C-21 waiting to take her to a black site in North Africa. Wheels up in 15 minutes. Jackson stared at the captain. She is leaving? The mission just ended. For you, maybe, the captain replied, his voice lowering with respect. For people like her, the war never ends. It just changes time zones. She came in, fixed the mess, saved your asses, and now she is on to the next fire. Jackson looked at the clock on the wall. 15 minutes. He didn't say another word. He spun on his heel and bolted for the door, ignoring the no running sign in the hallway. He burst out into the cool morning air, his boots pounding against the gravel. He had to catch her. Not for her sake. She clearly didn't care about his opinion, but for his own. He couldn't let the ghost of Iron Horse vanish without one final salute. The flight line was a deafening theater of wind and noise. The sun had just broken the crest of the surrounding mountains, painting the tarmac in streaks of blood orange and gray. A C-21 Learjet, painted in a nondescript civilian slate, sat idling at the far end of the runway. Its engines whined with a high-pitched frequency that cut through the morning air. Master Chief Jackson sprinted past the last checkpoint, his chest heaving. He wasn't running for exercise. He was running to catch a ghost. He spotted her just as she reached the bottom of the air stairs. Elena Vance stood alone. There was no honor guard, no brass band, no line of officers waiting to shake her hand. She carried the same slim, hard shell case she had arrived with. Her uniform was still clean, still devoid of any patches, as if the chaos of the last 36 hours had simply washed over her without leaving a mark. "Commander!" Jackson shouted, though the sound was instantly swallowed by the jet blast. He stopped 10 meters away, fighting to catch his breath. The wind from the engines whipped his utility trousers and stung his eyes, but he didn't blink. Elena paused. She had one foot on the stairs. She didn't look surprised to see him. She simply turned her head slowly, her hair pulled back in a severe, practical bun. She looked at him with that same calm, analytical gray gaze that had dissected his ego in the war room. Jackson took a step forward, intending to speak, to say the words that had been burning in his throat since he boarded the helicopter. He wanted to tell her that she was right. He wanted to tell her that she had saved 18 lives. He wanted to apologize for being a fool. But as he looked at her, standing small against the backdrop of the massive mountains and the waiting machine, he realized that words were unnecessary. They were too small. She didn't need his gratitude, and she certainly didn't need his validation. She was a professional who had completed a task. The outcome was the reward. So Jackson did the only thing a soldier knows how to do when words fail. He brought his heels together with a sharp, disciplined crack. He straightened his spine, pulling his shoulders back until his posture was perfect. He raised his right hand, slicing through the air with rigid precision until his fingertips touched the brow of his cap. It was a salute. Not a perfunctory check-in, not a casual greeting between peers. It was the slow, held salute reserved for the highest echelons of command, or for the fallen. It was a gesture of absolute, unyielding respect. Elena watched him. For a moment, her expression remained neutral, the mask of the Shadow Commander firmly in place. Then, the corners of her eyes softened. The ghost of a smile, genuine, tired, and human, touched her lips. She did not salute back. She wasn't military property. She was something else entirely. Instead, She simply nodded. It was a single, deliberate inclination of her head, an acknowledgement of the bond forged in the fires of the valley. She turned and walked up the stairs, disappearing into the dark fuselage of the jet. The hatch closed. The engines spooled up to a scream. Jackson held his salute as the C-21 began to taxi, moving faster and faster until it lifted off the runway, banking sharp and steep into the sunrise. He watched until the plane was nothing more than a silver speck dissolving into the light. Slowly, Jackson lowered his hand. The young captain from the TOC walked up beside him, shielding his eyes against the glare. "She is something else, isn't she?" the captain asked. "Do you think we will ever see her again?" Jackson shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the empty sky. "No. People like her. They don't exist until the world is ending. And when the world is saved, they disappear." He reached down and patted the pocket of his trousers, where the tracker she had given him still sat. A small piece of black plastic that had been the difference between life and death. "Come on," Jackson said, turning back toward the base where his men were sleeping. "We have gear to clean." The war would go on. There would be other battles, other enemies, and other medals to be won. But Master Chief Jackson knew that the greatest victory he had ever witnessed belonged to a woman whose name would never appear in a newspaper, and whose rank he would never know. She was the silence between the gunshots, and that was enough.